Well, welcome everyone to the YWCA Greenwich 2020 Stand Against Racism. I'm Mary Lee Kiernan, President CEO of YWCA Greenwich, and we're so glad that you've joined us. We hope you are all healthy and staying safe right now. We have a very important conversation coming up with Dr. Gautam Mukunda. We're really thrilled to have him join us. But first, just a couple of words about this very important event that we hold every single year. This week across the country, YWCAs are standing together to highlight the systemic forces that cause racism and really reaffirm our commitment to racial justice. And we want to thank, in particular, 120 different organizations, businesses, departments of our municipal government that are joining us in this virtual stand in 2020. Their names will be on a poster that will be in the Greenwich Time this weekend. We'll hang in Town Hall and the YWCA for the rest of the year, and of course, be on our website. And it's a very powerful statement, an illustration of how we are all partnering to stand against racism throughout the year. So thank you to all of those organizations. I also want to congratulate two very special high school students in our community who have been chosen to receive the YWCA Greenwich's Racial Justice Scholarships in 2020. And they are Dante White, who is at the Brunswick School, and he is president of the Diversity Action Club there, and Yolanda Lewis, who is a student at Greenwich Academy, and she's the co-founder of the Civil Rights Club at GA. These two students are making a difference in their communities, promoting awareness around issues of discrimination and racial injustice. We congratulate them and thank you for their work. They will each receive scholarship monies that will help pay for their college education. So congratulations to both of them. I also want to, as I do every year, just share a couple of reflections on current racial justice topics. And we've done our annual op-ed in the Greenwich Time about this, and I just want to mention two particularly distressing phenomena that we're all probably aware of that are going on right now amidst this crisis. And that is, of course, the increase in hate speech and hate crimes against Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. And then, of course, the racial disparities in health outcomes that are really being laid bare by this crisis. Unfortunately, there's been an enormous spike in hate crimes, particularly in subways. We've seen in both New York and LA in particular, and an increase in bias attacks against students of Asian American descent. This is according to information collected by our federation, the YWCA USA. And of course, a Reuters report and many reports have illustrated how African Americans are dying of COVID-19 at a much greater rate than any other demographic group in our country. And that is widely attributed, of course, to pre-existing conditions such as diabetes and asthma. And those pre-existing conditions are widely attributed to generations of disparate healthcare and social and economic factors that determine health outcomes. So I really want to just raise that up and ask all of you to take a stand with us against hate, the current bias against Asian American communities, and double down against all forms of discrimination. Really, let's turn this crisis into an opportunity to evaluate and address those social determinants of health in our communities and in our policies. Let's really prioritize health equity going forward, I hope in a new way. So thank you for your commitment to that and to promoting equity across all of our communities. So let's turn now to this really interesting conversation we're looking forward to with Dr. Mukunda. I'll call you Gautam, I hope that's okay. Let me start with his incredible background. Gautam is a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and the author of Indispensable When Leaders Matter, published by the Harvard Business Review in 2012. He's an accomplished academic. He's a member of both the Council on Foreign Relations and the MIT Security Studies Program and Program on Emerging Technologies. He is a Paul and Daisy Soros New American Fellow, an NSF IGERT Fellow, and Next Generation Fellow of the American Assembly. He's a principal investigator on the National Science Foundation's Synthetic Biology Engineering Research Center, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Chief of Naval Operations Executive Advisory Panel, and a Jeopardy champion. So the list goes on of his accomplishments, but we're just really thrilled to have you join us today. So thank you for being with us.
My pleasure, Marley.
So Gautam, when we first reached out to you about this event, we talked about you focusing on the theme of civic engagement. And this is a theme that comes from our federation, the YWCA USA, every year. And we continue to want to talk to you about civic engagement, but layer on, of course, the current crisis and what the implications are of COVID-19. So why don't we start off with what civic engagement means to you broadly, and then, of course, how has that changed with this pandemic?
So to me, civic engagement in the broadest of all possible senses is anything anybody does for the betterment of their community. And community could mean anything from your neighborhood to your entire country. Civic engagement, and social scientists who studied this going all the way back to Tocqueville in the 19th century say civic engagement is what makes America work. It's not our it's not our form of government. It's not our economy. It's not our constitution. It's the fact that Americans, well, sort of uniquely to a level not seen in any other country in the world, go out and get into groups and or associations and work to improve their town, their state, their city, and their country with fervor and activity. And that hallmark was what made the real thing that made American society so successful for so long. And so, to me, civic engagement is the essence of being an American. Is civic engagement. It is being part of something larger than yourself and working for something more than just than yourself or to make yourself rich. In this moment in time, civic engagement seems both more difficult and more important than it has been probably in any of our lifetimes. It's more difficult, of course, because we're all here. We're watching this from home. We're on Zoom. We're trapped in our homes instead of being able to get into groups. And the greatest reward of civic engagement in the immediate sense is the chance to be with other people working on a project that's worthy of your combined efforts. And it seems hard to do that here. But it's more important because clearly we're struggling. We are in a moment of crisis such that the United States has not seen in decades, maybe since the Great Depression. And it's going to need all of us to get through. We're going to need, all of us are going to have to chip in to get through, and we're all going to have to work together to get through. And only civic engagement can get us that way. But you can think of any number of examples of people who are doing that. Now, of course, the obvious ones are the first responders or the doctors or the nurses, the hospital staff, or the people working in grocery stores or drug stores who are risking their lives to hold the society together. And we can't say thanks enough to them. But it's not just them but who can contribute here. One of my friends put together an online matching program to help find and source N95 masks from all over the world, and has been able to do that, to find them from all over the world and get them here to the United States. We can all think of examples of people who are doing everything they can to chip in, knowing that this is the moment when if you stand up and you are counted, it will really make a difference.
Wonderful. It is such a profoundly important topic right now, and thank you for laying on the current crisis. Let's dive into the decennial census a little bit. This is obviously a very important act of civic engagement that happens only once every 10 years. Talk about the importance of the census and how that's changing right now.
The census is so important that it is one of the handful of functions that the Constitution explicitly says the federal government must engage in. So when the Founding Fathers were getting together to write the form of the new U.S. government, to create something entirely new, one of the first things they said that must be done is there must be a census every 10 years. It is the census that decides not just not just how many of us there are and where we live and how we live. It also tells us how our congressional districts will be apportioned, how state legislature districts will be apportioned, how government money will be spread from community to community and state to state. And the most essential phase, though, is the census is how we say, here we are, and these are our numbers. It is how you stand up and be counted in the United States today in the most basic and essential and sort of baseline way. So it's what we, right now, when you're at home, if you only do one thing, do the census. It matters. It will decide a great deal for the next 10 years.
Critically important. And, you know, we know that some of the census workers that are supposed to be going door to door right now and typically underreporting communities cannot do that. And this whole effort is delayed. So your point about the online access to this is critical. Let's talk about voting rights. Mm-hmm. Of course, another critically important element of civic engagement and really how it's very dynamic right now, how it's being impacted by the crisis.
Voting rights are under siege in the United States in a way that they haven't been since the 1960s, maybe even longer ago than that. And it's a tragedy that we've gotten to the point where there are debates about whether people should be able to vote as they're entitled to as a US citizen. But that's where we are, so we need to be aware of it. What we saw just recently in Wisconsin was essentially a major effort to disenfranchise voters, to make it as difficult as possible for people to vote. Now, that didn't work. And in fact, there's lots of evidence showing that such efforts are profoundly counterproductive, because it turns out that Americans care fiercely about their right to vote. And when you try to take it away from them, they will fight hard to make sure that they stand at the polling booths. But now that's even harder because we don't want to be in lines. We don't want to be standing out there. And in fact, we have some evidence that the election in Wisconsin may have actually caused an increase in the spread of this disease because of the need to go out and violate social distancing to exercise your basic right as an American. Now, many states across the country have used vote by mail. And in fact, the United States military has engaged in vote by mail since the Civil War. So we know can do it. We know it works. We've been able to, our men and women in uniform have been doing it for more than a century. And in fact, enormous research on vote by mail has found essentially no instances of fraud. It simply is safe, reliable, and effective. And it's something that can make it, it's something that we should have done a long time ago. But at this moment of supreme emergency, no, the United States government should never ask its people to risk their lives in order to exercise their most basic function of democracy, the chance to vote. So if you can do anything you can to help make vote by mail happen in your home, you need to do that.
So important. There are other elements of civic engagement I know you want to share with us and talk about how important they are and what it looks like today.
So civic engagement isn't just political, right? It's every sort of form of community service. So what we see all across the country, we see people preparing meals to get help to help those in need get food when they're sort of in first responder. We see companies, grocery stores that have hours that are just for senior citizens to let those of us who are those of our fellow Americans who are most at risk go shop for food safely. And I think what we're going to see over the next few months as this continues, and it will continue for longer, I think, than most people realize right now, is people are going to realize new forms of civic engagement that we can have online in this way. So right now we're just in the infancy of having to live our lives through Zoom. And I believe in the ingenuity people, they're going to figure out lots and lots of new ways to do that. And we're just getting started with that, and it will make a big difference as time goes on. We're going to need that.
So interesting to watch this unfold and how we can all continue to reach out and impact our communities with civic engagement. You know, everything we do, Gautam, we have to apply a racial justice lens to, and everything we talk about, especially at this event. Could you take a few moments just to apply that lens to some of those acts of civic engagement that we talked about? Voting rights, the census, running for office. We'd really like to hear your thoughts on that.
So engaging in that racial lens is profoundly important. It is perhaps the central tragedy of American life, that virtually nothing in it can be understood without taking into account the importance of race. Even the most basic functions of government are shaped in profound and tragic ways by the legacy of racism. Let me give you a simple example. Social Security was passed in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression. in order to make sure that American senior citizens had the chance to retire without starving, basically. Social Security does not include two professions. It does not include farm labor and household labor. And the reason that those two professions are excluded from the Social Security Act is because Southern senators insisted that they would only vote for Social Security if it did not cover those professions that were disproportionately held by African Americans in the South. Mm-hmm. So even the structure of a program as basic and seemingly simple as Social Security was driven by the racial history of the United States in important ways. And if you don't realize that, you do not understand your own country. So now, as you already said, what we're seeing is that COVID-19 is having a tragic impact on communities that have already spent centuries bearing the weight of discrimination in this country here. And when we think about why, we know that African American communities, because of the long history of redlining, are in neighborhoods that are more polluted, and we know that pollution predisposes you to risk from this disease. We know that they're in places that are more reliant on public transportation, and public transportation makes you more likely to get the disease. We know that they are in places that we know that these communities have, in general, because of the stresses of poverty, are much more likely to have other risk factors that are of ill health, which of course make you more susceptible to disease. And even beyond that, we know, and from experimental data and some enormous research on the subject, that the simple stress of being a member of a discriminated against minority in this country has negative impacts on your health. The pervasiveness of the experience of being the subject of racism in and of itself, separate and on top of all the other insults that one has to the health that you have to bear, makes you even more, it increases your stress level, it weakens your immune system, and makes you more prone to obesity. And of course, every one of those things makes you more likely to both catch and be severely affected by COVID-19. You could think of an epidemic as something that puts an entire society under stress in such a way that it reveals their deepest and most profound fault lines. And what we are seeing here is that the fault lines of this country are much, much worse than anything that most Americans were willing to acknowledge only a few weeks ago. In the sense of community, when we think about community engagement, what I would say is that twofold, is that one, any engagement that we do has to take into account the fact that helping your immediate community is wonderful and you should absolutely do that, but they may not be the people who most need your help. And how can you think about making sure that your efforts that you do go outside the particular community you live in to reach the people who not only most need it now, but who are least likely to be serviced effectively by the government and by the other institutions of society for all the reasons we just talked about. But the second thing I'd say is that when you do that community and engage in that sort of community service, it's really, really important to make sure that you are helping people in the way that they want you to help them, not in the way that you think they need to be helped them, because those are all too often very, very different things. The first obligation of any person who wishes to serve their community is to listen and to know that your perspective is just your perspective, and it may not be that of all the people whom you are actually trying to help.
Very important reflection, and thank you for that. We also wanted to talk to you about the hate, the discrimination that's rising against Asian Americans in our country, the xenophobia associated with this crisis. Please share your thoughts on this aspect and how we can all stand against that kind of hate in our communities.
So, I mean, it's a tragedy, and we've of course seen the last 4 years or so, of course, have seen a rise in hate crimes against all minority groups in this country, starting, of course, with African Americans, but expanding out very quickly to Hispanic Americans and now Asian Americans. And it's a tragedy of the current political dynamics that people are using explicit racial appeals in a way that even 20 years ago would only have been implicit. So people are willing to say clearly what before they only implied in terms of making racial. And when they do that, what you do is you normalize the sort of racial attacks that you're talking about and make it just easier and easier and easier to escalate from words to violence. The only way that cycle can end was in twofold. One is in the political world, what we need to show is that people who engage in that sort of behavior will be punished, not rewarded for it. If you use racial politics to try and get elected, what we need to teach people who do that is what we will actually do is we will throw you out of office. And that is profoundly important. But at a basic level, what it means is that we Americans need to reach out to one another as we never have before. We need to be there for each other, regardless of race, color, or creed, because guess what? It looks like no one else will be. If we can't trust the federal government to be there for us, we have to be there for each other. No, because no one is coming out to rescue us. No one will help us except us ourselves. There is no justice here. There's just us. We're all we've got. And so what I'd say to people is that it is enormously heartening to me to find out that the YWCA has had this kind of mission. Like that is exactly what we need. It's what we've needed forever, but it's what we need even more at this moment in time. And the more we are conscious of the fact that we can stand against these things, the better it can be. So what I would say is, when you think about this virus, there's nothing wrong with criticizing the government of China. I lived in China, so I can tell you there's a lot to criticize in the way that government functions, the way it had responded to this disease. But there's a huge distinction between criticizing the government of China and labeling this the Chinese virus, right? There's a choice in the words we use and what they imply about the way we view the world and who is responsible for what's happened. So when we look at communities, I mean, anyone who's relatively active in the public sphere knows about this. Like if you're not white on Twitter, you're going to get death threats. I do. Like that's just part of the deal, and you move forward with it. But when our average citizens have to face the same type of thing, that's a very different experience. And so it's great that we stand against racism in these settings, in this thing. And I can't praise the organization enough for taking the stand. But when this is over, what are you gonna do? When you go back to your high school or your middle school, and you hear about the Chinese kid who gets abused, who gets by their peers, are you going to stand up for them? Because that's what we need. This is just the beginning. It's not going to be over. This is not going to be over soon, and the long term, it's not going to be over ever, because its effects will last for as long as anyone who remembers this year was still alive. So the question isn't just what are you going to do now, it's what are you going to do 20 years from now? How are you going to live your life knowing that there are people out there who want to take the worst impulses of humans and of people, who want to take all the hatred and all the legacy of prejudice that has haunted us and make it worse for their own benefit? Are you going to help them, or are you going to stop them?
Thank you so much for that. And that's exactly what this event and the mission of the YWCA and YWCAs across the country stand for, to fight against that legacy of discrimination, to fight against systems of oppression, and to be upstanders, not just bystanders, but upstanders against ongoing hate. So thank you for putting that all so compellingly and beautifully. Any last words you'd like to share with us? We're, again, so appreciative of your time and your reflections.
Oh, thank you, Marilee. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to help in this or any other way that I can. The last words I'd say are this. It's easy to focus on the negatives in the way that this horrible epidemic has gone down. And obviously there are negatives, right? We've lost 40,000 of our fellow Americans, and that's a tragedy that boggles the mind. The NYPD, I just learned this a couple days ago. More members of the NYPD have died of COVID-19 than died on 9/11. And so it is a tragedy, and it's going to get worse, right? We are not at the middle. We're not the end of this. We're not at the middle of this. We're just at the beginning of this. But at the same time, I want to remind people that it's easy to see, a few people standing out and protesting because they can't get haircuts. But the real thing to notice is that 300 million Americans voluntarily, not because they were forced to by the government, not even because their leaders in the federal government told them to do this, but pretty much of their own volition said, I'm going to go home. I'm going to risk my job. I'm going to risk my income. I'm going to risk, my status in American society because I need to do the right thing. It's not just that I need to not get sick, because, you know, if you're young and you're healthy, your odds are decent. You're probably not going to die of this, although you could be very, very ill. But I'm going to do the right thing because I'm not going to get the people around me sick. I'm not going to let the people in the seniors home die. I'm not going to put doctors and nurses under more strain than they have to be. When you think about that, other countries have definitely handled this better. There's no question about that. But what we have done, what blows my mind, is the fact that hundreds of millions of Americans, almost every American, when it came down to it, when they were faced with this kind of a crisis, just about every American decided that they wanted to do the right thing, even at enormous cost to themselves. And if we can take that lesson away from this and remember that when it really comes down, when it really matters, we as a people are people who do the right thing, even when it's hard. Well, that's something that could make all of this worthwhile. Because if we do the right thing in the face of a disease, when it's this hard, you can do the right thing when the disease is past. You can stand up for your fellow citizens who can't stand up for themselves. You can speak for those without voices. You can use your strength and your compassion and your will to help everyone in this society who's been denied that strength or denied compassion because of who they are or where they were born or what they look like. We will get through this. That's not in question. The question is, who will we be when we get through this? And when I watch and see how people are doing the right thing over and over and over again, how almost all of them are, what it tells me is that who we are and who we will be something we can be really proud of.
Wonderful way to end our conversation, Gautam, on that positive note of being mindful of who we are going to become and who we'll be after this crisis. So thank you for that.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you so much for being with us. We really are grateful for your time and your expertise today.
Thank you.
Every year at this event, we literally stand against racism. The last couple of years, we've had over 200 people join us at the Greenwich Town Hall with a giant sign, 20 feet wide, and we get an intrepid photographer with a wide-angle lens to take a picture of this really profoundly important visual. But this year we're doing a virtual stand, and I hope you'll join me in holding up our individual signs to show that we're standing against racism today. Thank you. We're asking everyone around the community to do the same thing, and we'll be creating a video of this virtual stand against racism. So thank you for doing that with me, Gautam. And thank you everyone for watching. We hope you stay healthy and safe, and we'll see you again next year at our Stand Against Racism. Thank you.
Be well.